All right. I thought I would do a little book review and sort of talk about some concepts and ideas of this book, which is originally written back in 1950 by a gentleman named Charles O. Williamson. And he wrote this book called Breaking and Training the Stock Horse. This is 71 years old material. And Dr. Williamson, as he is actually a veterinarian as well as a teacher, or was a teacher and taught and started a lot of horses and did some dressage stuff. He was born an awful long time ago, 1897 if I remember correctly, and passed away in 1977. And he was back in, supposedly way back in the 50s or so, he was somebody that people talked about an awful lot in the horse world because he was really different. And if you were to read this book, you can't barely find this book anywhere. I don't know how I got it. I can't recall how I got this book, but I did. And I've been reading it over a period of a few months or so, bits and pieces. It's not necessarily long, but I don't know. I think it's one of those things, one of those types of books that you can read and you can reread it and read bits and pieces. You don't have to follow it in order. It's a pile of stuff. But so the Breaking and Training the Stock Horse. I find this book to be ahead of its time, is probably the best way to put it. Especially if we were to watch some of the stuff that is still out there to this day in competitions, very, very expensive competitions, and where lightness doesn't seem to matter to some, and any way, any means possible seems to be rampant. And I'm going to do something a little unorthodox maybe, but I think it's important. And we're going to need to get a little bit comfortable here because there's a few pages that I want to read from this book. And the reason I want to read it out is, in my opinion, it really gives a good feel for what Dr. Williamson wanted to get across to anybody who would listen to him, and I guess to anybody who's going to read a book like this. And there's a lot of material covered in this book. If you were to purchase it, it wouldn't be a bad purchase whatsoever. There's a lot of stuff in here that's useful, some not so useful, some stuff very old concepts, like a war bridle. That's one in here that looks pretty mean. Anyhow, so let's read this. If you want to have a pause and grab a coffee or tea or something like that, if you're so interested in this still, then let's get on it. So I'm going to read the foreword. The foreword of a book, if you're not much of a book reader, is essentially usually a bit of an intro or something that you put forth before the rest of the material. And we're hanging out with Mr. Fancy Pants here, who has been deloused again today. And it's coming along wonderfully. Okay, let's get on with this. Fine horsemanship originated during the Middle Ages when men first began to duel on horseback. In such a duel, the man whose horse did not resist the bit in the least and had been taught to respond to the slightest use of hands and legs and to the shifting of body weight, in other words, had been made supple and light so that he worked on haunches instead of forehand, and could turn, twist, and otherwise maneuver in a small space. Lived while his adversary on a stiff, moving, untrained horse went down to defeat, thus demonstrating that necessity is the forerunner of improvement. The tactics and details originating in those days of necessity are a little different from those used nowadays by the few men who know good horsemanship, and basic procedure is, one can almost say, fixed. Little new knowledge has been advanced in the last few hundred years, and the author by no means claims that he originated the idea of suppling a horse and making him light, but does claim that he is the first to apply this knowledge to the training of stock horses and horses performing related tasks, and one of the first to apply it to the training of polo horses, hunters, jumpers, and gaited horses. The principles of good horsemanship and horse training are rather easy to explain, but seem rather difficult for most people to grasp and put into effect. Generally speaking, good horse training is teaching a horse to do, with a rider on his back, the things he does naturally when free and playing in the pasture. The weight of a man on a horse, for some reason, puts him entirely out of natural balance, and unless he is trained, he performs when mounted for the rest of his life in a more or less stiff and unbending manner. Since horse training requires deep thought and an endless amount of patience, plus skill and tact, it is imperative that you possess or develop the necessary traits before you can be successful at this work. It is said that quite a large percentage of people refuse to read anything of depth because they do not wish to make the mental effort necessary to think deeply. If you are one of this group, or if you are one of those who say you could never get anything out of reading, you can learn better by just doing. If you do not have the patience to continually repeat and seemingly get little result from your effort, it is much better that you start to train yourself first. In assembling this set of instructions on horse training and horsemanship, effort has been made to eliminate all unnecessary words and sentences. Therefore, in its application, it is necessary that strict attention be paid to each and every statement. Failure to do so may mean failure in training your horse. To derive any benefit from this course in horsemanship, it must be followed from the beginning because the first lessons are the most important. They contain the fundamental principles of horse training and lay the groundwork for the final results for which the course is intended. For instance, a horse cannot be taught to stop properly and turn on his hind feet until he has first been suppled and made light and taught to respond instantly to the use of hands, legs, and body. It is the opinion of the author that any worthwhile book on horse training gives instructions for teaching suppleness and lightness to a horse. There are such books in print, but there are more of the other sort. Forget the old idea that because someone has been around horses all his life, he is sure to be a good horseman. Such is by no means the case. Many of these good people are very poor horsemen and admit it, while others feel free to offer much advice. Do not think that all people who make their living handling cattle on horseback are good horsemen, much less all those who wear so-called Western clothes and use so-called Western riding equipment and perhaps occasionally help drive a bunch of gentle cattle somewhere or chase a calf in an arena. Many of the real ones are poor horsemen, and many of those who are good horsemen ride in shoes and very much dislike a pair of chaps, which they never wear except for good reasons such as cold weather or for riding through thick brush. If you wish to appear rough and tough and keep your horse afraid of you and in a lather much of the time, if you wish to teach him to rear and walk on his hind legs, any mechanic can do it, it would be best if you gave this book to someone who is interested in horsemanship, such as is practiced by a few men of the ranges. Pay no attention to the old wheeze. Well, some people train horses one way and some another. All real trainers of saddle horses work above all things for the fundamental principle of lightness in their horses, even if they do not call it by that name. After this is obtained, horses may be taught almost anything. In other words, there are many who call themselves horse trainers who are mere mechanics working with horses. They have no idea of the principles which lie behind the proper training of a horse. If you will stick it out and follow these instructions and make just one horse light, you will realize the full meaning of the word and forever after will frown upon such crude practices as shoeing a horse behind and rasping down his front feet until they are tender, in order to force him to stop on his hind feet. working him against a fence to force him to turn, using severe bits in order to hold him, and other similar practices. All horses are two-sided as far as training is concerned. What you teach on one side means nothing to the horse when the same indications are used on the other side. Therefore, it is necessary to teach everything from both sides. The system of breaking and training horses taught in this course is not the usual system used, nor the one formerly used around the ranges of the West. Portions of this system were only occasionally seen because using the old methods required little knowledge of horsemanship, merely a knowledge of how to go about breaking a horse's spirit and forcing him to submit to anything the rider wished, not to be a partner to it. However, all men of the ranges were not so lacking in knowledge. Now and then one was found who really knew horse nature and who taught his horses rather than forced them. Those men made gentle horses and made them quickly. Instead of having to ride a young wild horse 2 or 3 years before a slicker could be put on and worn from the saddle, or a newborn calf could be carried in front of the rider, these things could be done after the first few lessons. Instead of taking it for granted that the range-raised colt must stampede out across the country and run himself out the first few rides, he was taught the use of the bridle, snaffle bit, or the hackamore in the corral before mounting, and when ridden out in the open, could be controlled with little difficulty. The few men who used these methods were usually unpopular with the other riders, but not with many of the owners. The usual cowhand does not want his cherished traditions of busting them, doubling them, and knocking sense into their heads disturbed. He does not care to meet anyone who knows better and who can make gentle horses that like to work. It is unfortunate for horses that there are fewer and fewer of this sort doing actual riding on the ranges. Learning the rough, usual methods costs nothing, and willing teachers may be found anywhere, even in town. Remember that when considering horsemanship, the use of weights, ropes, and other mechanical devices such as bitting rigs, tie-downs, tying a horse's head to one side to limber up his neck, and other such practices are mechanics and not horsemanship, and have no place in a course of this kind. Use of such practices makes a horse still more mechanical in its movements, and if he ever limbers up, it is through hard usage, and then the horse learns it in spite of the rider, not with his help. The teaching of tricks is not horsemanship in the strict sense of the word, although it is not objectionable if done without abuse. It is a pleasure to watch a well-trained trick horse perform. Tricks have nothing to do with fine riding. Do not make the mistake of referring to a trick or a circus horse as a high school horse. Such reference is very erroneous, as high school riding represents the highest type of horsemanship. It should go without saying that no one without a certain amount of tact and a leaning in that direction can never meet with much success at horse training. And the same is true for any other kind of specialized work. However, any horse lover could learn to ride and handle horses fairly efficiently if he would only apply himself. The author of this book has not yet learned to judge a horse's disposition by the set of his eyes, ears, or the appearance of his head in general. Oftentimes, horses with short ears, eyes placed close together, and other displeasing features have turned out to be the easiest to train, and it has been found that some horses with perfect conformation, including that of the head, learn very slowly and prove very difficult in finishing. Also, one horse, regardless of conformation, may learn some things readily and seem absolutely unable to grasp other ideas. It is best to start each horse with an open mind and vary the training according to what is learned concerning his disposition and ability to absorb the various phases of training. There are a few facts concerning horses which have always been unexplainable to me. One is that an untrained horse, when mounted, and often even on the halter, wants to turn on his front feet, but when loose in a pasture, always turns on his hind feet. Another is that any horse, even a spoiled horse with a hard mouth, will eventually become light on the bit and light to some degree in action by the continued proper use of hands and legs. Of course, there are many riders who are ready and willing to offer an explanation for these phenomena, but I have never heard one that satisfies me. It requires an endless amount of patience to train horses, but it also requires something else. It requires skill and tact. A great many people talk as if patience were the only requisite. Do not rush the horse in any period of his training. After all, a few weeks or even months in the training period is but a short time in the life of the horse, and there should be no hurry. In case a horse becomes stale in his training and sours, he should be left alone for several days, or at most, ridden casually. When following the instructions in this course, there will be times when it seems certain that parts of it cannot possibly be correct. But if you will persist and have patience, you will win out in the long run. Read and reread these instructions. As with any set of instructions, you will see something each time which you failed to see before. If you are one of those who, with basic instructions before you, cannot figure yourself out of petty difficulties in a sensible way in most instances, it might be well for you to consider that no one can possibly cover in a work of this kind all contingencies and possibilities which may arise. After the instructions on breaking, do not attempt to follow any other part of this course until you have carried out the instructions on suppling a horse and making him light. Lightness is the basis of all good saddle horse training. The author of this course in horsemanship and training has spent the greater part of his life in a saddle and many years on the remote ranges of the West. As a result, he believes that he has learned how not to train a horse, as well as something about how to train one. He has made an intensive study of horse nature and the things that cause a horse to respond to training, and feels competent to offer the advice and instructions set forth herein. One more little bit here. General remarks on horsemanship. Good horsemanship requires a large amount of tact. This word tact includes many things, and one of the main things is knowing when to pull and when to slack when handling a horse. Make it a rule to stay slack most of the time, whether you're teaching a colt to lead, leading him afterward, riding him, or holding a nervous horse for any purpose. This is very important. You cannot have success with this course unless you remember it all the time you are working. A horse responds to training to relieve pressure on some part of his body. He follows you when you are leading him to relieve pressure on his poll. He goes forward when the legs are used to relieve pressure on his sides. He stops or slows when the reins are pulled back to relieve pressure on his mouth. When he does what you want, if you do not slack and relieve pressure, he has no incentive to do the same thing again for you, and finally gives up in disgust and carries you about in a listless or even defiant manner because he must. Many horses become unmanageable until handled by different methods. Details appear under the different sections of the course. Another thing to remember is that a good horseman does not make nor force his horse to perform. He teaches the fundamentals of the use of the hands, legs, and body, and the horse performs willingly at the slightest indication of these aids, whether it be a sliding stop on hind feet, fast reining, or an intricate movement of high school. For that reason, severe bits and sharp spurs are hindrances rather than helps, and especially in spoiled horses. Also remember that being able to ride a bucking horse does not constitute horsemanship. If you can ride him on balance and not on a death grip, with the legs and a death pull on the reins, that is a necessary part of horsemanship. A good seat, but is only a small part. No credit is due anyone for being able to hold himself on a bucking horse by sheer strength of legs and arms. A horse seldom bucks with a good horseman, and especially if he has trained the horse himself. This next part is in all capitals. One of the chief objectives in learning good horsemanship is that of being able to have a horse perform and work with little use of the bit. A bit of any kind in the mouth of a horse is a very annoying instrument at its best, and is an instrument of torture when in the wrong hands. Phew, that was a lot. Even he's having a big sigh. Doing fantastic on this 1.5 inch hold haybag too, actually. Anyways, so that's kind of the start of this book, and I find that it's quite good. A lot of good thought processes in there. And I think that even this can be very, very applicable to many riders or trainers, people that want to be with horses. So hopefully that has been a bit interesting. And I will do a part 2 another time. But I'm going to start with this one. So I will see you guys in the next one. And thanks for watching.